I know that. But they are working in what we call the China bazaars of various kind of Indian cities and towns, and working on these technologies. When we went into the what's called, I mean, you can call it cost modeling or whatever, into the business part of it, a service phone, a service shop like what I showed you, that guy would be making about 12, maybe 8,000 to 12,000 rupees a month through the servicing on phone. But the big bucks was coming through his visits to Shenzhen every 3 or 4 months, because models are changing. And it's not just the models, but the display units, the internal configuration, and they are obviously connected to 3 or 4 major families who would fund them to go, and that's another realm of business. So again, the lines between who's a worker, who's a trader, who's an entrepreneur all gets kind of mixed up. So the other point I'm making, that the classical ways of looking at labor, capital get reconfigured, just as phones are getting reconfigured. Now, we started to look at this kind of diagram, and there's one PowerPoint outside of, I filmed, while we were doing this, we did this in a workshop in Bombay at Prasad Shetty's School of Environmental Architecture, and I filmed them developing this, so you can put on the headphones outside and you'll see them adding on parts. The Shenzhen figures there, okay, in a small corner. This one happens to be a Vietnamese website, of a website called Schematics, where if you want to fix your phone, you type up the model there, you use Google Translate, and you get an answer or a quote-unquote solution within 3 minutes. It can come from Vietnam, it can come from Brazil, any part of the world where people are doing this kind of stuff. So there's a kind of it links to the morning presentations of, I'm forgetting the person is here, the first, some of your mapping, where one of the arguments which I'm trying to make is that one needs to think about new kind of mappings of these kind of spaces. And but before we do that, and that is my other main argument, we have to rethink our categories of research, because if we don't do that, I mean, this sort of extension of the doctoral workshop, if we don't do that, there's a violence in the form of mapping that can happen, and I'll show you an illustration of that in the end of this, towards the end of this presentation. So those are the kind of places. There will be 2 or 3 other presentations tomorrow, so I'm not going to get into it. This is just a kind of advertisement for that. And that's what it will be about. I'm going to move ahead to, so this is just an image of our analysis of phones. By the way, and this is another issue, is that to enter any of these, in some sense, I don't know how to put it otherwise, but you have to do a little bit of this yourself, okay, to be able to understand the materiality. So whether it is numbers or anything else, you have to sort of engage yourself, get your hands dirty. So what I did is I taught myself electronics through YouTube, and I can't repair phones, but what I did is I started with LED lights, okay, like learning circuits for LED lights. And once I could at least I could know some basic parts of electronics. So when we are talking to people, because when Adil, whom I showed earlier, is going to Shenzhen every 3 months, he does not know Mandarin or Cantonese, but what he does know is the technical specifications of particular components and what's coming in the market. So one of the other things is that there's a kind of a language emerging of electronics which is international. And when you go to Shenzhen or any of these places, you see people from all over the world and stuff like that, and there's a lot of stuff being written about that. There's also an excellent documentary which we not put up there, but you can Google it and it'll come. If you Google The Wire, and after that Future Cities and Shenzhen, there's about an hour and a long movie on Shenzhen, which is one of the most interesting descriptions of one would call as this kind of new economic geography, and which is different from the earlier new economic geography of Paul Krugman and Stroop and other people. So I'm going to skip, and it's disappeared. Okay, that's the kind of map we came up with. This was in between our research. You can see a little bit of Shenzhen there, mainland China, various kind of circuits, how stuff was coming, getting re-engineered, and Bhuvana too will talk about this, I think day after. Sorry, we have our sessions the day after, not tomorrow. Okay, but you'll see that I just wanted to sort of give you a kind of sense of these kind of places. When I first went to Shenzhen and in 2008 and I think in 2008 or 2000 early, maybe 2005, sorry. At that time, a lot of people were carrying briefcases and samples in briefcases, stuff like that. Like this at the Bangalore International Airport. But towards now, of course, it's when we went there last year and did an extended tour of Dongguan, the industrial areas, and Shenzhen and Guangzhou, it's much more sophisticated through the web in terms of their financing networks, the way the bills are processed, the way it engages with the financial, there's no difference between the formal and informal. It's one kind of complicated net, just as you can't say whether this battery is formal or informal, okay? Because otherwise it won't fit. So there's a lot of stuff. I mean, the issues about where does the boundary of the factory end because of the sophistication of subcontracting. Now, this is just a slide on EWU. This was written in 2006. The figures have changed, and if you go on the web, it's like 8 times what it was then. But this is again one of the world's biggest commodity centers. Talking of language, I mean, I think what I'm finding fascinating is, and we talked a little bit or quite a bit of this during the doctoral workshop, is that you have to understand the language of the place. And I'm not talking that whether it's Mandarin or something, but how it connects up these kind of materialities. So at one point there was a very interesting report in the in one of the papers in Chennai on Georgetown, which is the old core market area where each street is a specialized one. And the person who wrote it, Prince Fredericks, he sort of made an interesting point that each street has its own language of trade, and these are not archaic ones because the trades are now highly international. But the point is this, that there's a kind of a structure of societies, how they're getting interconnected. I'm not saying that it's all one glorious picture. There are rifts between them, there are power structures. It's a hardcore business place, and obviously if you've seen any of these Korean movies, you'll see a lot of that. So I just want to make the other point that when we use the word Shenzhen, that is also not accurate, because we have to be much more specific about particular locations within it. So if I use the word Chennai, that's not as accurate if I use the term Ritchie Street. If I'm talking about Bombay, it's actually Lamington Road, Manish Market. Delhi, it's Nehru Place or Ghaffar Market. The reason why these are coming out of trade, okay? And this is how people locate places. There are practices. So the terms come out of again what we were talking in the earlier 2-3 days as to what terms to use, which are loaded in particular way. So we found it useful to use those terms which are loaded by the people who are involved in this, because we know the genealogy of where it comes from a practice, and that represents a certain politics. And that's not necessarily a local stuff, it moves across, trade names. So this is an earlier image again from something like 4 years ago about components of an iPhone. But that was when I first went to Shenzhen. It was the time of those the Shenzhen suicides and in the Foxconn factory. And a lot of issues came that what part of the value production was happening in the factory itself, and how much was Apple making of it. But even this kind of analysis got eclipsed as other kind of phones started to come. And even from a planning perspective, and I think this points to one of the questions put on master planning, is if you take even within the Shenzhen area, you can see it's a very planning category, non-conforming, conforming. But that doesn't again tell you, it's like in Delhi, unauthorized and authorized, unauthorized. Okay, so the point is that I think our usual kind of languages which are centered around a locality based plan, like you guys were discussing about zoning, those don't hold very well, because they have a status vision, whereas these people are across different flows. And it's not the Manuel Castells kind of flow, which is a kind of a nameless thing or full flow of capital, but it's a much more embedded form of set of practices. So I think one has to sort of look very carefully and think beyond what a friend of mine, Wing-Shing Tang, who's at Hong Kong Baptist University, and I are kind of exploring beyond a kind of a container approach to certain term where we box it in. And once we get into what in some parts of the world, including China, are called Shanzhai phones, like another word for pirated stuff. But that also doesn't hold, because it's again, as when we have been looking at the phone itself, you can't say that this is pirated or non-pirated. It can be duplicate or non-duplicate, original duplicate. There are a whole lot of kind of terms which start to come into circulation. This is a more recent form of writing. Look at how the phone itself is getting re-engineered from a company that is just moving into Sri City in outside Chennai. Yeah. So what Hosur is done to Bangalore, Sri City is doing to Chennai. It's a huge manufacturing here. Foxconn is moving there. And at one of the Taiwanese New Year birthday party, they had a birthday party for that. So I was sitting at a table with the Foxconn people there who were moving in, and they said the Foxconn factory just at the at the top of the pyramid. You're having a whole lot of suppliers, including those from Bangalore, interestingly, because Bangalore also has a lot of maker clubs. Okay, so there's a whole system of working technology in the city which is not bounded by the city. That's an entry point, but then the space of it is much wider. I think I'll move fast, and there's also stuff coming out from law, and that's something that I've always found really interesting, where you don't go a constitutional approach to law, but a huge literature on legal pluralism, which is now starting to engage with the kind of technologies that are coming up. And hence that movie in the Wired website, that's very useful, because normally you will start to see these as these cute maker club kind of places or some kind of informal sector. But in that movie you see that a lot of high-end Danish and Norwegian design firms are getting their product testing in Shenzhen, because it's like 1/3 the time to get things done. And this also has a history in Tokyo. The Akihabara place, which is now famous for anime and other stuff, is actually started as an electric city, and a lot of earlier kind of this innovative spaces were having, in that kind of anarchic kind of space. I'll go to, so there's just various kind of interesting writings on this, but a lot of this is coming from business and business studies, but to locate it in an urban context, and I'm using urban in a loaded way. It's kind of being, I think Adil is a very urban person in some sense, right? The first slide. So trying to think about that, where you can't immediately identify skill, illiterate, literate, worker, manager, identity, all these categories start to get complicated. So I think there's a huge opportunity to look at this area, and in terms of even opening up interesting and really exciting researchable ways of doing stuff. One of the things that Wing-Shing Tang and I are doing is we try to make a point about earlier forms of surveys, classical kind of ethnography which contain the person, and then we try to look at, if we do this kind of spatial stories, how do we understand the politics of how a place gets constituted. We were doing this, by the way, for a different purpose, I must clarify. We had got a grant from the Asian Art Archive based in Hong Kong to look at to what extent can artists, and that includes performance artists, through understanding of these kind of politics in Hong Kong, Kowloon, after the umbrella movement, raise different kind of conceptual categories than how we as geographers or sociologists or social scientists pose. Like, does the art process open up conceptual bounds? Because both Wing Ching and I were thinking about how do we really rethink place and space in this, and so we wanted to explore that. And as part of that, we wanted to mobilize this idea about, if some of you are interested, we can have a longer discussion, but I just want to place this as a, what do you call it, a place marker or something. So this becomes the way we were trying to work on it, and I think this would call for a particular type of mapping where boundaries start to be thought about in a much more sort of serious way, not taken for granted. And I think this is important because you can't say, is it an African trader Nelson sitting, standing over there, or like there's a very wonderful series from National Geographic about Africans in Guangzhou's what's called racially chocolate city, where they are intermarrying with local people, and the church becomes the place for them to reconfigure politics, their own identities and stuff. So in a sense, there's a, like in Ivu, when I went there last year, I was staying in quote unquote the Indian part of town, where you get 5 different types of Indian food. I mean 3 types of vegetarian food, including Jain vegetarian. And I was noticing after 5 o'clock when the markets close, it reminded me straight out of Lajpat Nagar, except there was this kind of well-built Sikh who was sitting on an electric scooter with his partner who was from Ivu, and they were speaking a mix of Punjabi and not just Mandarin, but a particular dialect which a friend of mine told me, which is from Ivu itself, which the traders use. Okay, so I mean, you can't, I mean, the kind of new kind of stuff that is happening, I think it kind of opens up space in a different way. And just to make the contrast, when I was involved in a project with the IRD on critiquing high tech, low tech, we putting together material, and a friend of mine who was looking at how the auto rickshaw moves from India into Egypt and then West Africa. Around the same time we were chatting, and his name is Philip Travestine. You'll see his videos on YouTube, very interesting on how mechanics rework not just the engineering but spatialize the machine, and how does that happen. So at that time I found, slightly later, this book on African cities, and here I want to kind of show which I would say is a kind of a disconnect with what's happening on the ground, and different kind of mappings, different kind of conceptual categories which I think are are violent, because they kind of cause, or they become the justification for interventions which, to put it bluntly, would disturb what's working. It may not be working fully perfect, but at least it's working and providing jobs to a lot of people. As quite some time ago we talked, it has a lot of embedded energy in it, and through these kind of conceptualizations, you can see in the first one, it says there, it's crowded, disconnected, costly. There's no time to get into it, but I'll encourage you all to download this copy. It's free, on the web, from one of the World Bank websites, and look closely at the categories, and then also see the film from the Wired magazine, and you see there's a kind of there's a problem of categories, and there's a problem of how do you then represent these kind of places. So one is of course the overarching narrative, which you can see in a very synoptic way, and you can see the economic logic that comes out of that, and the spatialization and what is being compared, Nairobi and Pune. Okay, and this, by the way, I was part of a World Bank workshop in 1998 with HDFC, where they wanted to reconfigure the Bandra Kurla area of Bombay, and this was the same kind of argumentation that was coming out of that point. And there's a whole argument about leveraging of land values, but if you look at it closely, the areas that Adil is the first area, which is National Market, not far from here, or if you go to Ritchie Street, extremely central city core, high land value if you take it in an abstract way, but in terms of when you locate it to the leasing systems, how is it that Adil and his school dropout guy can have a shop there? Okay, there's a kind of paradox. So there's obviously something else happening in the central city core areas, and we were all talking about, and I'm sorry to bring this back again, but in the research methodology workshop, a lot of you were mentioning, I mean, some of you who are here were mentioning about, I'm going to do ethnography, and this all sounds very nice. But this is a classic form of ethnography which closes space. So you got your images there, and if you look into the, again, this is from the same report, it doesn't have, it's a kind of a containerization, if there's a word like that, which contains the space of what possibilities there are in these kind of places. Okay, so I think the point is this, that even if you're doing ethnography, the way you do it, the way you frame the narrative, what comes out of in your interview, that one has to be very careful. And I think the interesting thing is here is how would you sort of think about research methods which links these kind of technological kind of changes that are happening and the fact that these are urban in a very, very powerful way, and these two things are linked, and I think, I mean, I'll stop there, but also encourage you to well, just like the advertisement, see those slide shows, but listen to some of the conversations and that are there in those slide shows, because I think they'll give you the materiality is important. So thank you very much, and by way of a closing remark, in case some of you have a dysfunctioning, non-functioning pre-2012 MacBook, don't throw it away. There are a lot of places here in Bangalore where they are completely reconditioning it. Post 2012, I don't think so you can do much, because Apple has sandwiched a lot of things, but thank you very much. Okay.
So this panel is titled Geographies of Technologies, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a twist. I'm going to keep my remarks to geographies of technology networks, because I think a lot of what we're interested in terms of technology is not about the object, but the networks themselves. And I have 3 provocations that I hope will stimulate a conversation among the 3 of us and all of us in the room. The first provocation is a question, and it's a really simple question, and I'd love to have a conversation around this question, which is, why do we care about whether urban places are networked in terms of technology? Why does it matter? There's a massive literature on networks, urban technologies, networks, systems, whether places are connected. And it doesn't matter whether it's about financial flows or labor flows or the production of Apple computers. There's a massive literature that basically assumes that if places are connected, they must be better off. Whether it's about the economy, the environment, productivity, economic growth, well-being, reducing inequality, improving sanitation, the presentations we heard this morning around electricity and water. I mean, the assumption, regardless of the technology we're talking about, but the underlying assumption is that if places are connected, they will be better. I mean, I think that's the assumption. I want us to challenge that, because much of that literature comes from a very particular time in history when places were not as connected, when there were these supernodes. I'm not going to mention any theorists in my comments, but there's lots of papers and books that suggest London and Shanghai and New York and Tokyo are these hypernodes because they're connected, right? All these financial flows go through them, or they're important centers because they've got these systems of infrastructure. And I want us to challenge that, because I think that when we look at many places today that are urbanizing, that have these systems of networks, of technologies, the assumption doesn't hold true. It's not that these places that are more connected and networked are better off, have economic development, have lower inequality. So I'm curious, how many people here have heard of the city called Ashburn, Virginia? I'm sure like some of you are going to quickly Google, where's Ashburn? So Ashburn, Virginia has the, it's been written up a lot. It's in Northern Virginia, and supposedly, depending on whose numbers you believe, something like 60 to 80% of all global internet traffic goes through this city. Most people have never heard of it. It's got about 40,000 people, doesn't have a university, it's not an economic powerhouse, but it is incredibly connected. You know, Amazon has a number of their web services there, but there are lots of cities like these that are incredibly connected now. Solly mentioned Dongguan. My own dissertation research 20 years ago was on Dongguan. Dongguan is incredibly connected to the rest of China and the rest of the world. 20 years ago, and even today, Dongguan would not hold a fly or a stick or whatever analogy you want to use to some of the major urban centers around the world. I mean, it's connected in terms of it being a manufacturing hub, but again, it hasn't achieved a lot of the assumptions or the accolades that we would want a connected place to be. So I guess I want us to ask the question, why do we care about whether places are connected? What is the frame that we're using? What are our assumptions about when places are connected? Now, some of these connections, specifically around sanitation, electricity, it's very clear. We can make a very clear argument, and the data show that if you're connected with electricity, you certainly have more opportunities for economic activity. And if you are connected with sanitation and piped water, clearly you have more opportunities for health improvement, right? So those are like the basics. But beyond that, what did the data actually show us, and what are our assumptions? So that's my first provocation. My second provocation is around system boundaries. I am very curious to know why we choose the boundaries we do. And how does that shape the assumptions and the findings that we make? So I'm trained as a geographer, I'm also trained as a modeler. And so immediately as a geographer, I think around a landscape, but as a modeler, I have to decide that I'm only going to include a particular system in my model. I'm not going to include the entire world, right? And even though over this past week, there have been lots of conversations, we've all said that the urban-rural binary doesn't hold, it's useless, yada, yada. Nonetheless, we have to choose some kind of boundaries. Just for the sake of our analysis, we're simply not going to analyze the entire world. When we do that, we immediately say, everything that's not in my model, everything that's not on my system boundary is not important for affecting what's happening here. And that has some really big implications for how we understand how this particular system works. So how do we choose the boundaries? That's my question. There's no right answer. How do we choose them? And what should we consider when we choose them? Should we choose different types of system boundaries for different types of questions? We know that there's no global data set on urban boundaries. And a number of organizations, I've spoken to a number of organizations like the World Bank who said, oh, it would be so great if we had like a data set, like a GIS layer of all the administrative boundaries for all the cities. And in those conversations I say, yeah, that would be great, but we have all the boundaries of the world's countries. That doesn't really help with policy, doesn't really help us make better decisions. It helps us with our models. But if we were to have these boundaries, that would in fact further limit our conceptualization of these geographies of networks and their flows. So my second provocation is again another question. How should we choose them based on the questions? What are their criteria that we should use? And how should we choose these system boundaries for different types of questions? So my third provocation is around agency. And here I'm going to tell you a little story. So I've been a professor at Yale for 10 years now. And before I moved to Yale, I was a professor at Stanford. And when I moved to Yale, a lot of my colleagues at Yale said, we're very, very curious. How are we different from Stanford? Students wanted to know, are we better than Stanford students? And I would tell this story, I'd say, the real difference between Yale and Stanford is when I was at Stanford, every month there would be an international delegation of ministers or mayors, policymakers from India, Korea, China, Vietnam, Nigeria. They'd come and they'd want to know, how do they replicate Silicon Valley? Nobody has ever come to Yale and said, how do we replicate New Haven? What I found fascinating about all those meetings when I was at Stanford was the assumption that there was something magical about Silicon Valley. And in fact, my first project in India 12 years ago was to compare Silicon Valley of California with Silicon Valley of India, which brought me to Bangalore 12 years ago. But all these decision makers came, and many business people came to Palo Alto because they thought there was a formula that involved perhaps 2 or 3 variables. A university like Stanford, some startups, and some networking. Like if you just got people together, they would come up with Cisco and Google and Facebook and all of these things. There was a complete ignorance or lack of understanding of the history of Cold War politics in America, the funding by the Department of Energy into national labs, some of which were in California, the effect of federal highway funding and how that shaped California in Silicon Valley. And there was this long historical legacy that enabled Silicon Valley to be what it is today. And then there's this path dependency and inertia. But yet hundreds, if not thousands of people came because they believed that there's local agency today that could shape a place to become Silicon Valley. So I give you that story as my third provocation about agency. How important is agency versus structure? And this is an old question. It's been written about for a long time. For those of us who are parents, it's the question of how important are genetics versus the environment in which the child is raised. How important is the history of a place and the structure of a place versus an iconic mayor or an iconic university? Because when we think about the very first question I asked, like why do we care about the structure or the network of places, I think at the end of the day we're interested in well-being, human well-being, societal well-being. And at the core of that is something around our capacity as individuals or as policymakers or a society to make this place better. And so how important is structure versus agency? And it's not really a binary question. It's more, how do we conceive of both of those and think about them when we think about these geographies of technology networks? So those are my 3 provocations, and I'll pass it over to Aro.
Okay, great. Thanks, Karen. That was a very good place for me to pick up on. So I'm going to try and take this into, try and connect up with some of the discussions we had over the last few days, both what Karen and Solly said. But I guess I've been trained as a technologist, so some sort of initial framings which may be useful and relate to what I'm talking about. The first thing, of course, is the power of technology is often in its ability to very rapidly change scale. Depends on how you set the numerals and do whatever it is, but it's about increased productivity. That's a lot what the Industrial Revolution is all about. So for a certain amount of input, whether it's capital or labor, X and Y and Z, you do a hell of a lot more. That's what saw, for example, the complete collapse of India's textile system, which was the largest system in the world for 2,000 years. But very quickly, over a couple of decades, it was taken over by something else, by a set of small innovations that happened in rather, at that point of time, peripheral places in the middle of, in the Midlands and in England, from spinning to whatever it is. So, that's one thing. Productivity is one. The second thing, of course, is acceleration. So, you change things really, really rapidly, and very often, as we've seen in the case of transportation or on energy systems or X and Y and Z, you have this exponential curve, and the exponential curve can actually shift very, very radically. And that leads to a whole series of disruptions, especially when you have a series of exponential curves that come one after the other. And typically successful companies or countries try to jump from one curve to the other. It's much nicer to say and see in an analytical piece of work or piece of theory. In actual practice, it's hugely disruptive of both history and geography, and of course the people who live in those histories and geographies. So that's the other thing that it tends to do very quickly. And we're experiencing this. I mean, what Solly was talking about here, if you just look at the history of all the machines that we've had over the last 20 or 30 years, and the way that cell phones have gone from X and Y and Z, that's the other sort of disruption that you have in terms of scale. But there's also something else that we don't often, it's tied to both, and that is it completely, technology can very dramatically transform the rates of flows and the thresholds that change the system from one sort of regime to the other. Because many of the systems we talk about are first non-linear. We don't necessarily see them. We live in a linear world, and much of our academics is sort of linearized versions, because that's how calculus was constructed and a whole range of other things. But in a non-linear world, you can very quickly go beyond a threshold, and technologies often sort of help make that change. And that's the reason why in our context today there's this huge push, at least in India, that you will use technology to be able to address a whole range of things that have got nothing to do with technology. Technology will be able to deal with all your questions of economic growth, of development, of inequality, of social class stratification, etc., etc., etc. And that's a confusion of categories in some senses, because it does that in some places, but it creates a whole range of other challenges. So that's the nature of the seduction that technical systems actually bring, because they affect those kind of changes. So that's one context. And what I was saying in the morning also was, much of this has not been studied effectively in terms of space, and that I think is a challenge for urban scholars. The spatiality of this is quite well known. In history, you talk about the movement of stuff, but if you look at the history of technology, whether you look at Needham's work, in the classical work on China over a couple of thousands of years, much of the work in Europe on innovation and technological change, and the rather thin work in India from Habib and Dharampal and a whole range of other people on the history of technology and the nascent stuff that's happening in Bangalore. It's usually set in an abstract space which is often defined by time, but not the spatial connections. And I think trying to introduce the space-time element of it and the connectivity, what Solly was talking about, and the messiness of that gives us a much better idea of how innovation actually happened and how it connects not to the bigger narratives, but the narratives of everyday life. Because if you go back to, as a framing thing, we're sitting in what I would call the fourth sort of large sort of wave of globalization. But there are many common elements in the last, between the fourth, which is happening notionally now, they call it the fourth industrial revolution in some sense, etc. What happened in the 20th century, what happened in the 19th century, and we've seen all of that in our histories here. And Bangalore is a wonderful place to tell that story, because it's a crossroads of many different conflicts and processes, and it sort of plays itself out. So in that context, when you start spatializing these processes, you understand, especially if you start looking at the history of Asia or the Indian Ocean region. If you look at the textile trade starting way back, but certainly from the 12th, 14th, 15th century, and the movement of different techniques, you look at the equivalent of what you have today in Machilipatnam, which is a very important center of textile technology, and the movement of techniques from there right across the Indian Ocean through Southeast Asia into China, or the movement in the reverse of, let's say, pottery and ceramics. You know, people go to France and Germany and Scandinavia to buy certain forms of ceramic, which of course the Ming and before that had sort of become a high industrial art, which was being, it's been traded considerably because of. So we have lots of histories of these complex, the stories that he was telling, and Karen was talking about also, are very real stories in our geographies. But the point is, we've lost those connections. And if you go into the urban fabric of many of these places, whether it's in Indonesia or Java or Kochi, or even if you go to Jaisalmer, you find these connections, and the flow of these processes have been there in the past. And in some senses, whether you look at metallurgy and the sort of expansion of a whole range of metallurgical innovations from this part of the world for a very, very long period of time. Some of the best steel in the world came from extremely, within quotes, backward regions in this country, and actually went through the Arabian Peninsula to the rest of the world. So in some senses, like we try and now import sort of arms from other places, you were trading steel and weapons from here, and horses were coming from other places. The reason, what I'm trying to lay out here is the fact that cities and technology have been very closely associated, and many of the trends that we see today have happened in the past, but the rates of change that we see are fundamentally different, and we need to be able to try and unbundle that. And what are the ways of doing that? One way of doing that is, like I tried to lay out in the morning, is by looking at this as a system of flows. So very often when you see a city, you get seduced by the stocks. Okay, so there's Manhattan with all these skyscrapers there. The same thing is being recreated in Shanghai. Somebody else is trying to do that in Amravati, etc., etc. So you look at these large stocks of things and people, and in a sense that becomes the identity of the city, or the created identity of the city. But in actual fact, both within the urban boundary, which we would talk about, the urban system, and between them, the really interesting thing to look at are the flows. And in fact, the real power of technology, in a sense, is that it does change not only the rates of the flows, it changes the connectivity between the flows, and it alters the ratio of one flow to the other. So if you look at, for example, the terms of trade between natural capital, human capital, physical capital, which the Industrial Revolution was built on, and what I would call financial capital, and whatever it is. We don't actually have a thing for the noosphere, and IPR, Bitcoin might actually provide that. You find the ratios of the terms of trade are defined by the technical systems and who actually controls that. Yeah. So if you just look at the returns of investment, I'm going into sort of economics at the moment, in some spaces, at the current point of time, it is no surprise that we do not value the environment, because the returns on investment as far as the environment and natural capital are either zero or negative, while financial capital, we're always looking at LIBOR and how that thing works out. So how the ratios of these processes actually flow is a very important thing to deal with. So very often we confuse the idea, and there was a question in the morning about agglomeration economies within the urban scale. And they are moderately well understood things as far as that's concerned, with the connection between scale, that is how the neighborhood relates to the city, how the city relates to the region, and how the region then connects to transcontinental networks. These are embedded systems, And we don't actually know this, and I guess this is what one of the questions that urban science will start looking at is, are there panarchies between them? Are there connections between those processes? Are there slow and fast dynamics between them? And in some senses, the most dramatic changes of both social and economic and technical transformation is the ability to be able to enable entrainment across scale and between scale. So we have to start thinking maybe a little bit differently. We need to start unbundling some of these processes which are quite critical. So one classical way of looking at this is that you move from, and it's a canonical way of looking at it. So I'll lay it out and then look at the contradictions in that. Especially in an environment like ours, which is a country which is in 650,000 places, of which only 10,000 are urban. So what drives those places? The bulk of the places are still driven by a deeply agrarian economy. It's an economy or a metabolism that's driven by food and by biomass, trading and a whole range of other things. I mean, of course, the cell phone is everywhere and stuff like that, but the primary commodity, the primary flux and flow, the primary use of people's time is really in dealing with systems that we've had for a few hundred or 1,000 years. And the big challenge, of course, is as you move from agriculture and agricultural allied occupations into other things, how do you actually shift your skill sets and your engagement from that set of flows to more physical, more productive flows? And this is the real challenge you see here. You go to, we were talking about this sometime earlier, you go to let's say a relatively backward tribal area in Orissa, Jharkhand, which has much of our resources. You have a forest dwelling culture, or you have an agrarian culture, which is now confronted with a large 6 or 10 million ton steel plant. How do you actually bring those cultures together? You displace the people and you say, well, I'm going to employ them in this industry, but the entire culture, the entire knowledge system, the entire terms of trade and engagement are completely alien to them. So it's not surprising that if you go a generation later, you find that things are much, much worse than when they actually started, because the livelihood systems have completely transformed themselves. So we have a large and complex biomass economy, which is being transformed dramatically by both economic forces and geography, because as global trade comes in, a whole range of things. And then the standard model of development is that you move from agriculture to more industrial development. That's what in sense China has done. There's a sort of creation of a set of physical flows which are essentially driven by fossil fuels. Fine. So starting with the late 18th century, going on to the 19th. Again, I'm telling a canonical story. It's not like this in many places. So these fossil fuels come in, you have a hell of a lot more energy, you don't need lots of people, you don't need slaves, you can actually produce a lot more with the same amount of resources, or you can extract more resources to produce more things, and you have a capital stock driven process which can grow, and that meets its population, and then you have this sort of standard model of development which says if you have more things, you have more output, you're better off. But we know in terms of human welfare and some of the things that Karen was alluding to, that's not necessarily true, right? But this metabolism, in a sense, drives both the imagination and the functioning of a lot of sort of these supernode cities that we've seen. Now, this might have been fine, I would say, in the early part of the 20th century when we had 1.2 billion people in the world, or even the middle of the 20th century, and after the Second World War when you have 3 billion people. We're now coming to a world, or we're already in a world which is 7 billion going to 9. So you've moved from a system and process that may work for 1 billion or 2 or 3 billion people, but now has gone 2 or 3 to 5 times depending on what the baseline figures you have. So what's the outcome of that process? The outcome of that process is the entire biosphere has been significantly disrupted by our forms of production and consumption, which assume that you can introduce the systems linearly in the middle and there will be no impact downstream or upstream. That's not true anymore. In fact, both of us, like a lot of us here, work on climate change. And the reason I'm taking you through that story is we've suddenly found that there's a massive feedback loop, which works globally, of course, and now increasingly regionally, which is actually constraining this frame of urbanization and this metabolism. Fine, and it's real. I mean, we have drought here, we have flooding somewhere else, etc. What does it come from? It comes from the metabolism from rural areas, of course, in large countries like ours, because there are large numbers of people, but it fundamentally comes from the urban metabolism. So the metabolism that gives you the ability to create jobs, to create productivity, to enable wealth creation, etc., because of the way it's constructed and what actually drives it, and the fact that it's not circular in some senses, is creating very severe global and regional challenges. So one of the most critical questions that we're dealing with now in this sort of fourth wave of globalization, in this world that's full of people, which has really productive technologies, which has given us the wealth to notionally address the end of poverty and all these fancy things, is the fact that we have to transform this metabolism. We cannot anymore, and we actively work on this problem with, both of us at least. How do you enable the transformation of a fossil fuel based economy into one that is not fossil fuel based? Fine. Which is a question that came up in the morning then. How do you move to a renewable driven economy and yet retain the growth of productivity? How do you dematerialize that process? And how do you create a more equitable environment? Because we know that what technology often does is it tremendously concentrates power and wealth with certain sets of people. And eventually, that doesn't work. If you look at Piketty's work, that equilibrates at some point of time. There's one big conflict, and then things get kind of wiped out. It's not a good way of doing it. So if you look at this, and I said this is a canonical frame. It doesn't work. It's very problematic. But one way of looking at it, we actually have to enable these transnational networks and these processes to transform themselves and shift in an environment where feedback now is starting to affect the basic structure from where we started in the first place. And hence, some of the questions that Karen is asking are really important. Why is connectivity important? We assume, and at least for the last 20 or 30 years, as the global trade regime has become quite important in the post-70s period that's there, we assume the connectivity that's around trade should actually be, is a good thing. And India, of course, we've had lots of other debates. We heard it, echo of that today in the rural-urban debate. It goes back to Nehru and, Ambedkar and Gandhi on that question. Why can you not develop more autarkic engagements? Can you do that for a million people? Can you do that for 1 billion people? Or can you do what China is doing just now, and that is creating large mega urban regions over 150, 200 million people? I mean, does that work? Is it sustainable or not? Are there sort of limits to that process? Are there non-linearities, etc.? There are a whole range of technical questions as far as that's concerned. So if I link that back, there's an assumption here that connectivity and greater productivity and efficiency, which cities in a sense tend to build because of network effects inside as far as infrastructures are concerned, can be linearly scaled to other systems and processes. And that may not be true. There may be threshold effects that actually limit that. We know that as far as water is concerned in this environment. That's one thing. The second thing is, because information technology and a whole range of other things enable decentralization in a way that it was not possible to do in a centralized world that was driven by coal and oil and a whole range of other things, are there new possibilities that these kind of geographies and connections can enable, which actually enable a new system of production, consumption, economy, distribution? And the reason I'm saying that is the core constraints that we have at the moment, land of course, that's a fundamental constraint, and we'll hear about that tomorrow and day after. The second thing is water. I mean, water is probably the most limiting condition that we have pretty much in most geographies in the world, certainly in this part, in Australia and other places. Fresh water is a very, very, very serious challenge. And what we're learning just now as we reach the margins is that needs to be managed locally. So the question is, what are the local systems of sharing, production and consumption in a region that can manage surface and groundwater effectively, can manage efficiency effectively, not going the Israeli way and deal with that. So water is now obviously, at least in our context in India, is something that has to be done and managed in a much more decentralized but a much richer way, because it's complex, it needs a whole range of things that are there. So we need a new regime. We're trying to develop a new regime of actually managing water more effectively by doing everything from recycling efficiency to doing X, Y and Z. The other big question is, how are your transportation systems actually structured and organized? And this is a very important question at all of those scales. So if you look at shipbuilding, for example, which we don't often think about when we think about urbanization, shipbuilding has been absolutely critical to the second, third, and potentially the fourth waves of globalization. Yeah. So whether it was Chinese shipbuilding and the production between the Arabian Peninsula and India, which controlled the monsoon trade, The construction of ships and trades were very closely allied to each other. The creation of European navies was critically related to shipbuilding. And subsequent to that, because this planet should have been called water instead of earth, every new hegemonic power has been built on the construction of course, a fighting navy, but fundamentally around a mercantile marine. And you see that movement from Western Europe, the United States during the Second World War, from there to Japan, from there to South Korea, now to China, in terms of who actually builds the ships. Because global trade as we see it today, commodity trade, dealing with food prices, a million other things, is a very critical element in enabling this global culture of urbanization. It's not possible to manage with the disparities that we have of production, consumption, et cetera, without doing that. So that's a big, big question. So that's the core infrastructure that we often forget. The other classical example is railways. In a sense, India has been constructed as a nation and a territory effectively with the development of the railways. The unintended consequences of 1857 and a whole range of other things that happened when the British were here, but in a sense the railways actually enabled that process. So if you look at the development of railways here and what China has been trying to do in the last 20 years, very, very strategically, where they recognized that it's really important to not go the high intensity route to enable connectivity in a regional context, and they've built a wonderful process by of course investing a huge amount of money, I guess at some points of time 1.5% of China's GDP, in building these high-speed rail networks. But what happened about the technology? Where did the technology come from? It actually it didn't originally come from China. It came from Japan, it came from Germany, it came from from Canada a little bit, Bombardier was there, but very systematically China was able to draw in, partially through commercial interest and very, very smart thinking in terms of technology transfer, et cetera, all the best technology in terms of high-speed rail. And now after having processed this through over the last 10 years or so, they're able to now, or ready to sell that back to the same countries that it came from. So in fact, if you look at whatever, in California, the link between SF and LA, my bet is that the Chinese will actually build it before the government actually builds it there. So there's a strategic relationship between where the state and sort of these technologies actually exist, but how these processes are actually connected and how they help link and you think about the relationship between regional development around urban systems is quite interesting. So another take, and I'll sort of close with this, is a lot of the 20th century was really about, and especially the latter part of it, both the Gulf Wars, was really about the control of oil and gas resources, and that's a lot of the and I guess that's tied to two things. One, of course, is how the energy economy works, and the second thing is a very critical device, which if you go back to Mumford, he talked about this way back in the 1930s, the motor car, not only as an object and an enabler of mobility within the city, but also between cities, the interstate system and all the other kind of stuff that's there. But looking at where that industry developed, originally partially in Europe, and you can see that with car manufacturers today, and of course in a very significant way in the US, and you can see the growth and decline of cities, and the story of Detroit is tied to that. The idea that the car and the modern city are completely sort of conjoined twins is a very powerful idea. It governs the imagination of people across the world, and we know both from the energy and the equity and the access story that is a complete fiction. In fact, those of us who work on this, we know that maybe the trend has turned in many parts of the world. It has not turned in our part of the world. Just one technical system, which is linked to an underlying energy source. But it's linked to a whole range of services, and in some senses, most important when you look at advertisement, the idea of freedom is something that not only shapes industry and economic development, but the actual urban fabric as we've seen it today. So part of the battle that we have with dealing with climate change is actually to change the urban fabric, where you start unasking the question of what mobility is. And we've talked today about modal split and stuff like that, but the larger question really is, do you need this device or this technology to actually take you where it is? And whether urbanization and all this kind of stuff are the second decimal point in that process. So I think as we look at technical systems, we must understand the power relationships and the locations where they come from. For example, I don't know what the numbers are now. I think it's about 4 billion or so. The number of passenger the passenger units that are there in the world tourism industry, driven by the air transport industry, right? But where are aircraft produced? At the moment, there are actually two big monopolies in the aircraft business. One is Airbus, which sort of came together because of a whole range of things, otherwise it wouldn't have worked in Europe. And the other one was because McDonnell Douglas and everybody else went down, and the US Defense Department did various things, is sitting with Boeing. You have some counterpoints. The Russians had something. The Chinese are now trying to build their first sets of commercial airliners, and the Brazilians have built a very effective industry around mid-class airliners that are there. When you start thinking about the connectivity and power and where the resources flow and how we would actually build and run these things, the geographies of where the creation takes place, who actually uses this. India is the third largest sort of emerging market in terms of air transport at the moment. We're actually going to become quite big after the US and China. And the conception of land-based transport, how do you actually use trains versus road transport, cars versus planes, is something that I think we need to think about. Because whether it's the conception of the aerotropolis, or the idea that you can hyperlink, and the fact that you can bring in the IT industry into Bangalore precisely because you have an international airport, and then now we will have a metro link directly from the airport to Electronic City. Okay, we need to be able to understand the connection between these multiple scales, because the logics of each of these technical systems are connected. If we have to move and decay into, let's say, biofuels, which have a dramatic 10, 15, 20 years, there are limits to what you can do with solar PV. There are limits to what you can do with onshore power. The rest of the stuff is going to come from what we call, whatever it is, BECCS, carbon capture and storage. They're land-based processes, fine, which will then push back with water security, with food security, with a whole range of other things. So when we're looking at urbanism and urban connections and urban transformations and other processes, we're in a world now where all these systems are interconnected. Not that they were not earlier, but the impact can be felt now in quarters, in years, maybe in 5 years or a decade, where it would normally take 100 years for it to actually play itself out and organize itself. So as we think about technical systems, where the innovation happens, where the knowledge is, what people actually need, we need to look at context, spatiality, its temporal aspects, and this multi-scalar process. And again, I can cut this another way around and give you another way of actually doing this, to understand how each of these flows and the stocks that are concentrated in cities actually play themselves out. Because if we don't do that, I think, forget about management, and we will not be able to get a sense of actually how to use cities. And cities can, and we don't talk about that very much, cities can be terrible places. They concentrate opportunity, but they also concentrate risk and inequality. If you look at the coming plague, the plague will actually happen like dengue and chikungunya and all the kind of stuff, because you have large concentrations of populations in urban areas and you haven't provided adequate services to them. There's inequality as far as that's concerned, and health systems are very sensitive. If you don't get up to 95% coverage, there's no chance of actually being able to effect and manage those processes effectively. So I think we really need to sort of break a whole range of boundaries, which we've been trying to do here, to try and make these connections, because for better or for worse, we might find ourselves in a global urban culture, whether it has polynodes or supernodes or it's fractal or it's X and Y and Z. It's certainly happening, and much of that creation is happening in our geographies. And if we're going to capture and use models that worked in other places and other times, we might be in a little bit of trouble. And that's why, examining what we have just now and what you people are doing, and actually trying to build a theory which tries to understand what the connections are between them, to try and see how we can scale and connect, may actually be useful and sort of interesting. So that was sort of my provocation, building on Karen and Solly's. Solly and Karen, would you like to respond? Any quick thoughts and comments on that, or we just leave it open? Or, yeah. Okay, all yours. Floor is open. Mic, folks.
If you can just introduce yourself.
Glenn Keeker from DePaul University in Indiana, in the United States. And thank you for the amazing presentations. And I'm curious as to what the panel's thoughts are with the idea that perhaps we're right on the edge of a major transformation, especially in the structures that will alter the relationship between the urban form, the technologies, and connectivity. And I think the big players in this are a combination of things like the impact of blockchain on logistics and the flows that we were talking about, the impact of analytics, megadata, and the implications that has, right, for all sorts of things with the way that the city works and its connectivity. But then perhaps even more significant is how these then interconnect in that space. And I think you were hinting at it at the end with machine learning, artificial intelligence. This is right on the edge within the next 15 years of seeing something transformative play out on a global scale, a civilization game changer. We can add to it quantum computing. They're right on the edge of that. The speed with which that connectivity will happen will make us, look like, back in the age of the typewriter. So if we're looking at a structure agency question, for example, we might face a landscape where the issue of adaptability of the pace that humans are capable of adapting to the pace of the change that's happening in the technology becomes too big. Right, so there's kind of a big kind of human question as to what does that mean. So I don't know if there's ways that you want to respond to that potential for that very large scale structural change, any of the three of you.
Should we take a few more questions? Yeah. Can we just, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Something that I was wondering, kind of in response to what you were saying, Karen, about kind of the structure and agency question, I think what you said kind of intersects with that, is kind of the role of intellectual property regimes and patents, right? So I think when you're talking about, why should we bother with administrative boundaries when we're looking at these connections, to me the obvious answer is that IPR is actually, it invents innovation, right? Like this whole idea of Silicon Valley exists because of patents and proprietary software. And I think Solly's kind of paper is a really interesting kind of counterpoint to that. But then when we're looking at something like blockchain, which is kind of threatening the ownership and kind of delinking and allowing a peer-to-peer network, then that's going to kind of accelerate in this very interesting way. And so what I guess my question is that if we were to bring kind of thinking about IPR and patents into the regime of thinking about the urban, is there a place where they intersect, or how would we see it through that lens?
Any other questions? And then we can just take the block.
I'm Neha Sami, I'm faculty here at IIHS. I actually have a question that kind of links what Solly was talking about and what Karen was kind of thinking about in terms of thinking of networked cities and actually building the physical infrastructure that that connects them, like in space. So bridges and ports and things like that. But I'm thinking particularly from the work that I've been doing around mega infrastructure projects like the industrial corridors that are being built, and the kinds of technologies that are being used both to build those, but also what it means for what's going to be used in those places itself. So, when you think back to places like Shenzhen or Nehru Place or, National Market here, the imagination for a lot of these new locations that are emerging around these corridors is a very different one from these. And I'm just interested in hearing sort of your thoughts on, both sort of Solly's and your thoughts on the kind of pull and push between kind of this government sort of policy level push that we're seeing on building large kind of structured employment opportunities that are extremely kind of technology driven, but are kind of not really taking into account a lot of the realities of the kind of things that Solly was talking about.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. If it's tied to, then we can just pick it up.
Hi, my name is Tara Atluri, and I work with the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto. My question, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the suicides of workers in Foxconn factories and the treatment of workers in the technological sector in Asia.
I'll tackle the structure questions first because I think it's a really good one. I think that we aren't even ready for the massive disruptions underway. And I think blockchain is a great example. You mentioned urban form, but you didn't talk about it very much, but I'll give a little example that's been discussed quite a bit in the US. And that's just e-commerce, right? E-commerce hollowing out traditional commerce in urban centers. Some of the major department stores that have been around for decades, if not more than 100 years, are either closing, shrinking, completely disrupted by e-commerce, right? That's a really small thing. I mean, for a while people were saying Amazon's hollowing out bookstores, but it's actually more than that. That's minor. The idea, and linking it to what Arrow said about the rapidity of change, I mean, do you remember the days of going to the library and wandering around in the stacks and reading different, just looking at the titles and being enamored by, like, who has the time now, right? There's this tension that we've got to get more done. We're on this I have this vision of me as a rat, like I got to get more and more done faster and faster, and so we don't have the time to go to the store to browse the books that we want or the clothing that we want. Instead, while we're commuting to work, we're now going to order something online and hope that it's delivered within a day, right? I mean, that's disruption, I think. I mean, I think that there's the disruptions in, I mean, I'm using e-commerce as the example, but because it's tangible for a lot of people, but I think there are other technological ones that you've brought up, like quantum computing. And I think a lot of this actually has to do with acceleration of either our demands or supply. And that then changes fundamentally how we think even about the city. Like when I say accelerating our demand, I mean, it used to be that we were happy that things were delivered in 5 days. And now Amazon's thinking about, like, they're in some cities in the US, they have delivery within 3 hours.
Yeah, drones.
Right? Right. And that's an acceleration of our demand as well as an acceleration of supply. But anyway, I think this is I think the disruptions that are going to be underway, self-driving vehicles, lots of different things that we can't even imagine how that's going to disrupt urban form and urban life itself.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
completely. And I think linking to Neha's question around these big infrastructure projects, there is a push by a lot of policymakers to make cities more efficient. And the assumption that if they're more efficient, they're going to be more productive. And yet, I think for those of us who spend a lot of time in hundreds of cities around the world, the most efficient cities are not the most interesting ones. And what's interesting is in the work that we've done in understanding global strategy of firms. Why does Microsoft come to Bangalore? Why did they move to Pune? Why are they going to Shenzhen? The limiting factor there is actually not labor, and it's not land. The limiting factor is how can they get middle-level managers to go to these places. That was a theme that came out in a lot of our work. How do we attract NRIs from Redmond and Palo Alto and Seattle to come live in these places for 2 or 3 years, and in Shenzhen? And that ends up being about the soul of the city. It's not about whether the place is really efficient, right?
In fact, directly as a follow-up on that, I'll give you 2 instances. One in my own work on East Delhi, I mean, this is like really long ago, 1996, where I was looking at a kind of industrial cluster and making cable conductors, wires like that. And more recently, when we are doing this current research, there's an image of a guy in one of the PowerPoints outside who's doing soundboards. Starting with a guy who does soundboards mainly for the Bollywood sound mixing, sort of, the Bollywood industry. And this comes to this point that he has work time when between he opens up at 11 and 3. That's his work time where he does not accept anyone coming to give him any orders. He charges them 3 times more if they disturb him during that time. Okay, and after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's not a big shop. I mean, you can see his image, in the PowerPoint. It's like a really small place. So you would expect that there would be kind of intensity of what in the old 70s kind of literature would be called self-exploitation. Get the family involved and then extract the labor, and this madness and rapidity of change that's going to drive them. And this sort of comes back to your question about the Foxconn CISA, which we were there a week after it had happened in the Foxconn factory. And we asked them off record because they take you in a kind of conducted tour under almost like armed guard inside. But coming back to his name is Pradeep. I mean, I think I'm just giving the name because it's there on the thing. And what was interesting is that this kind of craft of doing electronics, and these are people. When I saw similar type of people and the very same kind of stories of valuing a particular slow time. It's not that they're working with traditional technology. In fact, at the same time, they were using very high-tech stuff with very, what you would see as traditional ways of cutting and retooling and stuff. So that was not the case. But their system in this kind of an economy, in the Lamington Road or what we are seeing in the phone systems, the re-engineering, is extremely niche-like and valued, and where kind of a classical notion of craft is imposed. Now, I'm kind of emphasizing this because there's a wonderful book called Outcasts London. It's by Stedman Jones, which looks at industrial organization in London during Victorian society, where he makes the point that the actual change of London's economy, which was a city of small firms, was not that of technological innovation or change per se, but it was how finance was controlled, how it sought to remove the guilds and then re-control what for Pradeep would be his time. Okay, and in the Foxconn case, what was the worth of the workers, which soon after that also started, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong in Mandarin, called by Shanghai. Shanghai is like the pirated iPhone, but I mean they went beyond the iPhone. After some time they found that they could do their own versions which had better features without the cost. Buy Shanghai and show love for your country. Okay, because the idea was that you're trying to recover a kind of space and reconnecting with how what form of capital would be. So I'm trying to say that in these spaces, and if you look at the industrial cluster and just what you were saying, the big shortage or the big key point is that I know that you're working on a particular skill and you're valued for that. And however, and these are like, if you talk about the quote unquote, the businesses and all, it's not that it's craft without the business. In fact, it's a very strongly business model in terms of what you charge, but your skills on a particular thing is different from another person, And the other point I was making, and this was pointed out by Jibesh Bagchi of the Rux Media Collective in Delhi, when we are having this discussion, is that a lot of on the IPR and the patenting issues, and this is also coming out in some of the work in one of the Canadian law department, the reports I showed you about. I think there was a thesis at MIT just when I was finishing in 1996 from the Sloan School of Management, where she was arguing, and it's a doctoral thesis where she was arguing that for India and China to move ahead through economic development, it is imperative that they do not follow patenting rules and regulations. Okay. So the other point is that if you look right from land tenure, which is how I was entering, I'm entering a lot of these economies not from the economy perspective, but I'm entering from the land setting. I mean, that has been my kind of a hang up for some time, is that you get very diverse tenural regimes, which in a metaphorical way would say that you cannot patent or you cannot get a fix on who owns the land. There's a kind of ambiguity which allows claims to be made based on who's sitting where you're sitting, what you have occupied next to you. There are leasing, and these are not informal arrangements. So if you go into the complexity of land records, how it's mediated, how it's recorded, it's fairly, it has a kind of a history that is there. And a lot of these places, it's not surprising that you have this kind of leasing systems, which then link into how you define what is property. So even if they are copying stuff, there's never a direct copying. It's always mediated by how you want to change a particular thing. Yes, you can train, you can track down certain ustads in the system, like she has had a particular skill, so she's a kind of ustad of this particular part. But then how it gets modulated and transformed, it's fairly sort of a kind of open space and mediated. So it's not, it's a tough space. But I think the issue is this, what I'm trying to make is that it's fairly difficult to fix the kind of property rights which seems to be on the surface that has that kind of hegemonic hold. Because even when Apple has moved away from this and moved into sticking stuff, and in phones like say the one that I have, or I mean a lot of you would have, about 16,000 type phone, okay, of Samsung, where the sensitive screen is sandwiched, so it's called a combo, okay. These kind of phones, and when we've been talking to electrical engineering sort of professors at IIT Bombay, I was sort of connecting more with them for a variety of reasons. They were explaining me that the new ones are coming is really the $4,000-5,000 one, which have the possibility to change these, because when you break this, then you're stuck. Okay, so you would like to get a form which is the non-combo form. Because it depends on what you want to do with the phone. If I'm not too worried about my display, but my camera is good, and I know I'm going to ultimately translate it, then I don't mind what's called a duplicate at instead of 4,500. Because if you got a $9,000 phone, like phone In Touch, we're looking at a case study of, the original one is costing 4,500. That's what they're charging you. But if you get a original duplicate, then it's about 1,500. If you get a duplicate, it's like 250 bucks. Okay. So I'm just telling you the scale of, but it depends on what you want to do with that thing. All I'm trying to say is that this attempt to fix property, I suspect in this kind of expansion, and again coming back to this point about what gets connected and all, I would say I would look at it not from a normative question, because what I'm suggesting, that's the way the world is. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but it links to your second question. If this is how the world is operating, then how we fix boundaries or we don't fix boundaries, if we don't understand these material processes, we can push for either, okay, you got these policy makers, I mean Neha's question, you got policy makers, who are implicated in certain kind of lobby kind of process, and they kind of sold out, and then they make these big moves which they know that, if I'm putting a Bangalore port in Bangalore, a big port, I could have actually put up that same investments into a series of smaller ports which actually interlink with in terms of the economic spread, because we did a study on this, in terms of fishing nets right up to Latin America, in terms of the produce from all these smaller ports going up to Korea and Japan and stuff like that. But that was also at the cost of the Chileans who had control to that, where an earthquake went and disturbed them, so suddenly these guys took over. So I'm trying to say that this is not it's very sad for the Chilean fishing industry, and these people have taken over. But this is the way the world is connected. But you can say that, going back to Neha's question, that, well, maybe this guy is putting this big Bangalore port because the Reddy brothers in northern Karnataka, who are exporting iron ore to China, are able to play the government and get that investment made. So I think that the sort of tone of the property system, I suspect today it's much more, I'm using messy or fluid in a good way, and it's highly contested, and I think that was at the core my understanding of the anti-Apple and Foxconn protests in the Foxconn factory in, I think, 2000. When was it? It was in 2009 or so, 2010, somewhere around that time. Because there was the first phase, and then there was a gap, and then there was another round. And I think the critique of the when we asked the people in Foxconn, the guy who had shown the official presentation, and then we chatted with him later, he said that a lot of the controls were in that part of the Foxconn factory, which was established by Apple Corporation for them as to what they could do and what they could not do. So even to use the term Foxconn becomes complicated, because there were multiple almost systems of regulation and control, and I think one would have to do a very deep analysis of how the workers organized, what they faced, before we could say that it was a Foxconn suicide or an Apple suicide, because it's much more complicated in terms of, it's a bit like the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. I mean, it's not really a movement, because there were several groups who were pushing for certain things, and one will have to get the history of the land in Kowloon, which would then shape things. Sorry. We went on.
So, yeah, sure. Let's pick up more questions, please. That's really useful. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, we should just go.
Hello. This is for Karen. Your provocations about network and imagination and interconnectedness, agency and structure, the boundaries. These can these not be used in a better way as a methodological tool rather than in its material or metaphorical uses. Their use as a methodological tool could unravel a lot of complexities which the urban spaces contain in them. But yeah, I agree with you that your example that this material connectedness doesn't mean anything for a city. So I too have a similar kind of example. So there is a place, a remote place in Madhya Pradesh, which is the hub of coal mines and power plants. But it is not. Many of the people don't know that place, but that place produces around 25 to 30,000 megawatt of electricity in India, and it is incredibly connected to the northern, to whole of the western and the northern grid in India. But people don't know about. But yeah, ignoring that, but uses of network as a methodological tool would certainly include that place in our imagination, and as Arumar pointed out, that the kind of feedback which is coming up. So when you switch on a bulb at your home, what is happening in Singrauli, in that region, is the question we should be looking at. Thank you.
Sorry, are there any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, there was some other hands there.
So actually, in the context of decarbonization, you talked about how dynamic rates of flows are, but when you look at the systems themselves or the technology themselves, they're very static and they have this inertia. So how do we then look at transforming them, and how much is agency really important in all of this? And what would the next kind of 50 years look like, you know, in that context, when you think about the Paris Agreement and all that? So just since you've worked on that.
That's a hard one. I mean, she was the CLO of Chapter 12. So two things that are there. The first thing is that, you know, people talk about coal power plants as being stranded assets. The biggest stranded assets are not coal power plants, they're cities. A lot of our cities are really stranded. I mean, physically because of adaptation, because they may be close to the coast, but really the structure and form that we have, including the cars and whatever it is, and that's what I think some of the work that Karen did in the last IPCC assessment is about. Form is very important and critical. And because of the sort of inelasticities of land markets and other markets, the ability to shift form is much slower than what the technologies can put in. You can put optical fibers and you can do X, Y, and Z, but the underlying systems of how capital accumulates and how it's distributed actually changes much slower, that's tied to political and sort of institutional dynamics, which we often don't take into account. So part of the real challenges are not only behavioral, so people say, okay, you know, you can fix your consumption and reduce eating meat and stuff like that, but it sits in these really difficult spaces, which are between social systems, institutions, and the state. And that often is a very serious barrier, like we've seen today. I mean, you know, you can reform the electricity system in a particular place. That doesn't mean that it's going to change the sort of incentives so that you get more efficiency and X and Y and Z. There's a lot of stickiness in that space, and I think that's where that's an unexplored space, because whether you know, Castell deals with it in a very sort of airy-fairy manner, but how does social learning take place at dramatic scale? And you know, one of it may be disruption because of AI and, you know, quantum computing and stuff like that. But I think one of the things that I think we're searching for is, in this fairly complex networked environment, there will be emergent behavior that we don't necessarily understand. And some really smart people do understand that. I mean, one of, you know, Lenin's great slogans was about electricity, because he saw that as a transforming element to and he did. It worked for the Soviet Union and whatever it is at that point of time, of actually changing from a very agrarian, feudal, serf-like structure that Russia had into something else. And I think, you know, as scholars and as people who work in the space, we're trying to look for some of those processes, whether they're endogenous or otherwise, that can enable us to work. But a lot of this is about the imagination. I mean, the single largest infrastructure and urbanization project in the world, in all of history, is something that's called One Belt, One Road. Okay? It's tied into a certain form of, whatever it is, transforming the Chinese economy in X and Y and Z. But that's very critically driven by what kind of infrastructures you have. It's driven by a completely different one part of it is driven by a very different imagination of how energy will come. So we were discussing this at lunch. One of the underlying assumptions in the modeling behind One Belt, One Road is the fact that that China will, as it does currently, control 70% of the manufacturing market as far as solar PV devices are concerned. So like a whole range of companies, including maybe IBM at one point of time, become sort of irrelevant. The Exxon Mobils of the world, as the transition happens, will actually become largely irrelevant, or the Rosnefets or whatever it is. So in that kind of environment, if you control 70% of the production of solar PV, and you have $1 trillion of investment to enable countries all the way from Morocco to Mongolia to actually set up large production facilities, and you have this new mega infrastructure, HVDC infrastructure, really ultra high voltage DC, you can actually set up a energy flow chain. You're talking about us and Singrauli between Morocco, which is 12 hours away from, or whatever it is, maybe 9 hours away from Shanghai, and have an entire day of production available using renewable energy. So, and that is about urbanization along those networks that connect you into Africa, that connect you into Asia, and of course, the trade routes, which is partially that's an imaginary which may not work itself out because the system may not work that way at all. It may be a state-driven imaginary, and if the state itself transforms itself, the imaginary will go away. And like we've seen with the Silk Route, with you cut off the head of Constantinople, and then the world changes. Are we going to see similar kind of processes or not? Are the interesting questions that we need to ask. I mean, in terms of where we might be going, etc. Okay, maybe we should close now. Yeah. And yeah, we can have lots of bilateral conversations. I'm sure they're in order. Thanks very much. It's been a good day and good evening.
I'm so much better now than I was a few days ago.
A few more things. Thank you for the panel, Aro, Karen, and Solly. I just want to remind everybody that we have a